African-American jockeys were a huge part of the very first Kentucky Derby in 1875. 13 of the 15 jockeys were African-American, and of course the race was won by an African-American jockey, Oliver Lewis. Even beyond that, 15 of the first 28 runnings of the Kentucky Derby were won by African-American jockeys.
In the 1800s, the institution of slavery created a workforce that helped make Kentucky the center of the horse racing universe.
Slaves were taking care of the horses in all facets. That included being jockeys. So the original jockeys were slaves. You'll hear names like Simon, a very prominent slave jockey who rode a horse named Haney's Maria, who beat General Andrew Jackson's horses on several occasions. And it continued as we get past the Civil War in 1865.
Without the black jockeys, there would have been very little racing in Kentucky. And Kentucky became the mecca of African-American jockeys. Willie Sims was from Georgia, Alonzo Clayton was from Kansas, but they all came into Kentucky to gain their reputation.
Well, when we look at some of the jockeys that dominated the very earliest Kentucky Derbies, Jimmy Winkfield, who won 2 Kentucky Derbies. Isaac Murphy is probably the name that you're going to hear most associated with dominant jockeys in the early Kentucky Derby. Not only was he was one of the greatest jockeys really of all time and is still recognized as such, the first jockey to win 3 Kentucky Derbies and was the very first jockey to be admitted to Racing's Hall of Fame in 1955.
Isaac Murphy gained a reputation as a gentleman. He was also known for his great love for his wife, Lucy.
A lot of jocks back then, nobody thought anything about throwing a race. He never threw a race. He was known for his honesty, that if you put him up on a horse, that he would do the best he could to win.
While few relics remain from this era of racing in the African-American jockey, the Kentucky Derby Museum in Louisville has one that actually reminds us where the term for the winnings of a horse race originated.
Well, the museum is very fortunate to have some artifacts directly related to great jockey Isaac Murphy. One is a silk purse from the 1891 Kentucky Derby. The significance of that purse is that it would have contained the winnings for that race.
In the post-Civil War era, the racing industry was a business that crossed racial lines between owners and jockeys. For them, there was only one color.
If you get a jock who rides a horse and wins, you tend to want to stay with him. It's like they said on a racetrack, the only color that counts is green. I'm certain race was an issue when people came to betting. I'm not naive about it, but the thing about it is on a racetrack that you got to remember, if the best jock out there is a black jock and you want to bet on a white jock because you don't like black jockeys, you're literally going to be paying for your own prejudice, because the black jockeys were enormously talented, just as gifted as their white counterparts.
Churchill Downs has the names of the horses who won the Derby, ridden by African Americans like Alonzo Clayton, Willie Sims, Billy Walker, and Soup Perkins.
Everybody talks about his name, Soup. James Soup Perkins. James Perkins was his real name. But he was a very young jockey. He entered the racing industry at the age of 11, started really seriously making a name for himself at the age of 13. He lived in a house on Thomas Street, which was just behind the Kentucky Association racetrack over in the East End. And he talks about having jumped the fence to go into the racing paddock, into the stables. His brothers, William and Frank, were trainers, and his father, John Jacob Perkins, was also a trainer.
Like many African Americans in the area who worked at the racetrack, Soup Perkins is buried in the African Cemetery No. 2 on 7th Street. Tombstones, many weathered by time, tell their stories. Some tell of their occupation, like this bugler. One unidentified soul is marked simply with a horseshoe. It is the home to the first Derby winner, Oliver Lewis. Another tombstone shows how young these riders were. And one shows how appreciated the jockeys were to the riding stable. But sadly, one tombstone was removed. It now stands in the Derby Museum. Isaac Murphy's body was removed from the cemetery, eventually to be buried alone, at the Kentucky Horse Park, next to the statue of Man of War. While considered to be an honor and to share with the world this great name in horse racing, Isaac's beloved wife Lucy was left behind at the African Cemetery No. 2. Her body was left unmarked, forever lost, forever separated from her husband. As America grew into the 20th century, the era of dominance by African-American jockeys finally came to an end. First, as many former slave families migrated to the cities, but also with changes on the racetrack.
During the last part of the 1890s, there was much contention between the black and white jockeys, and the racing industry became very dangerous for them.
As racing becomes a more lucrative profession and being a jockey becomes a more lucrative profession, more white athletes are interested in the races and being a jockey. And we have record in the early 20th century of many African-American jockeys like Jimmy Winkfield, the last African-American jockey to win a Kentucky Derby. He was a victim of rough riding, and there are instances where he was in a race and jockeys were getting close to him, roughing him up, running him up against the rail, trying to intimidate him on the racetrack. When that starts to happen, trainers are reluctant to use African-American jockeys because they think it's a disadvantage to their horse. So you have just the outright racism of that time period that contributes to it.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Isaac Murphy is probably one of the most underrated jockeys still. Some will, elevate him as one of the greatest jockeys ever because he won 3 Kentucky Derbies. But no one really talks about his intellect, how he won the races. I believe that his mother had intended him to just become very educated and move on in his life and use his education to his advantage, maybe go to college, maybe move on to a different location. But his mother gets sick around 1873. And the Freedmen's Bank fails, and so she loses everything in Freedmen's Bank. And I think she had the foresight to believe that if she doesn't get him positioned before she dies, he's going to be orphaned. And if he's orphaned, anything can happen. And so he gets apprenticed off to a few gentlemen, Owens and Williams. And they have him as an apprentice jockey. And it just so happens that head trainer Eli Jordan is a friend of the family's. And Eli Jordan helps train Isaac Murphy in the ways of becoming a jockey. He was very successful. He was able to maintain this career from around 1874 to 1894. He had a 44% winning rate as a jockey, meaning that, 4 out of 10 races he would win. He was smart. He was very smart. And then, he changes the game. He changes horse racing, and then people catch up to him because they study him. And the ones that beat him are the other black jockeys. They study their mentor. Isaac Murphy, at the end of his career, was accused of being drunk in the saddle. And in fact, in my research, I found the smoking gun. He was poisoned. Gamblers and other jockeys apparently plotted against him. When he was identified as being a drunk jockey, the spectators, the owners, they used that against him. So he dies in 1896, and he disappears from history, basically. And so that began this quest of finding Isaac Murphy.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.
This marks the 146th year for the Kentucky Derby, and over the years there have been so many changes. We do want to take a look back this morning on a forgotten part of its history. To most people, this is what the Kentucky Derby looks like. Flashy hats and fascinators for the women, unique suits for the men, and beautiful, powerful thoroughbreds. The jockeys are also a main attraction, but they look much different than they used to. In 1875, for the first running of the Derby, African Americans dominated the racetrack. 13 of the 15 jockeys were black, including the winning jockey Oliver Lewis. This is part of the history you can learn about at the Kentucky Derby Museum.
For many of them, when they see it, it's the first time they're learning about the history, so there's a sense of discovery.
And a sense of appreciation. The racial tension we're seeing in 2020 with inequality and injustice was also felt back then.
That segregation impacted African Americans in daily life, so it impacted them on the racetrack.
The horse racing sport went from 15 of the first 28 derbies being won by African-American jockeys to decades without a black person mounting for the race.
As we get into the 20th century, African-American jockeys start to disappear, and the reason, of course, is the segregation of the 19th and 20th century.
It became difficult and sometimes impossible for black jockeys to even get licenses to ride. And if they did, they ran the risk of being hurt. One example, Jimmy Wingfield.
And his white counterparts on the racetrack tried to physically intimidate him by basically pushing his mount and himself against the rail. That could injure Jimmy Wingfield, could injure his horse.
The museum documents this history, paying homage to the jockeys who laid the foundation for the Derby. They were African American, and they're often forgotten. This exhibit helps to keep their stories and their memories alive. And from segregation issues to now, there are still very few black jockeys in the sport. Churchill Downs says black jockeys were left out of horse racing for years, and they're committed to sharing their stories of those athletes. They also said they decided to move forward with the Derby despite calls to cancel because they wanted to focus on traditions that bind us together as we try to fix the things that tear us apart. The Louisville poet and activist Hannah Drake says while they recognize that tensions are similar to those in the past, we don't have another 50 years to wait. She says justice delayed for too long isn't justice at all. Drake says she looks forward to having a dialogue with Churchill Downs, and we do have Churchill's full message to the community on our website if you would like to read more about it.